reparenting is the process of like nurturing your own inner child. And so that's really applicable to anybody because we all have a little inner child. So if you are someone who wants to parent differently than you were parented, if you are trying to really be a cycle breaker, like if you're aware of significant trauma or abuse that you do not want to perpetuate in your own children, I would definitely engage in this. And then I'd say if you are someone who you notice that you are experiencing a significant level of distress or anger when your child is engaging in like less desirable behavior, or if they have big emotions, if you're noticing that that's really coming up for you, I would then say that it's worth looking at reparenting or even just approaching some of these things from that perspective. Reparenting doesn't have to be in the way that we're talking about it. It doesn't need to be a really, really intense process. It really can just kind of be like an everyday sort of thing, an awareness that you develop.
Hey everybody, Ashley Cooley here, host of the Bringing Up Baby podcast and owner of Birth Baby Sleep. Today I'm talking with Abigail Barth about reparenting. The name says it all, but basically it's meeting the needs of your child self that were not met when you were actually a child. So this might not be super relevant today for those of you who are pregnant or just have a young little one, but as your baby grows into a toddler, starts to become more mobile, starts to become more vocal, you're having conversations with them, tantrums are starting, all of those kinds of things. As parents, we can start to really reflect on ways that we were parented and things that we might want to do differently or the same. And these questions kind of seemingly come up for lots of parents. So I wanted to talk to Abigail about this reparenting idea because I think it's super cool. So grab your pen and paper because she is going to get into some how-tos, questions that you can ask yourself if you want to look into some reparenting for yourself. But this is going to be a really great episode to listen to and get a feel for what this all means. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Abigail. Hi, Abigail. It's so nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
Stupid. I'm just kidding.
Okay.
It feels like, see, you've got the theater background. I can't restart. I'm gonna. It's like cut.
That's fine. We could
see.
Acknowledge, hey, this is the third time we've tried this, and
Yes.
we keep laughing at each other.
Okay. All right. Hi, Abigail. So nice to see you. Take 3. Let's try this again. How are you today?
Sure. I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm great. Always a good time chatting with you. I'm really glad you're here.
Thanks.
We spoke a few months back talking about something very different, but there is an episode where we talked about birth trauma. You shared some really insightful things around, small T versus big T trauma, and which I still think about. So for anybody who hasn't checked out that episode, I hope they definitely do. But before they do, they're listening to us now. Would you mind saying hi to everybody and share a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Abigail Barth. I am a social worker living in Calgary, Alberta, but I'm actually registered in Alberta and Nova Scotia. And I run a practice called Two Birds Counselling. And Two Birds Counselling specializes in perinatal mental health, specifically trauma and grief work. And what makes me a little bit unique as well is that I actually practice from more creative methods. So I use expressive arts therapy and something called narrative therapy. And we were talking before we started about how I have a background in theater. And that's one of the reasons that I got into these kinds of creative approaches, because it is just a different way of addressing some of these things that are really difficult to put into words.
That's it right there. And I think really what drew me back to you, I knew we were going to be talking again. It was just a matter of what the topic was. And you had a post. I see all your posts on Instagram. I love them and follow you on your stories.
Thank you.
Because you're very not just insightful and good at what you do, but you show a part of yourself that not a lot of people show. And you have a point of view that is really I think important to share. So one particular post, I see a lot of you dancing and dancing things out. So I love those. And I
Oh,
totally
yes.
get why, just releasing that energy and whatnot. But you had a post, or it was in your stories, and it had mentioned something in this term called reparenting, which to me, when I hear that word, you almost don't have to explain it to me. Like I
Yeah.
just feel it. It says so much, but I would love for you to explain it, and just what does reparenting mean to you, or in that context. And yeah, talk a little bit about that.
For sure. So, what's actually really interesting about what you just said, right, is like we don't need the idea of reparenting to be explained to us. And I was like, yeah, I don't need that either. I do it all the time.
Hmm.
And then I thought, to prepare for this, I'm going to look it up. And it turns out that it was way more than I thought it was, in that it is originally it was a kind of therapy in which the therapist took on the role of the parent and provided an opportunity for there to be a really positive relationship with a quote unquote caregiver. Um, in my research, that's not really practiced in the States like in that way. Obviously, there can be a lot of like ethical considerations there. A lot of people like wouldn't be comfortable doing it in the way that it was originally designed. But the way that we think about reparenting currently is the idea of meeting the needs of your child self that just weren't met when you were actually a kid. And so anyone can do this. But because I work specifically more around trauma, it's very often used in that sphere. So if you experience trauma yourself, the opportunity to kind of be your own parent, to provide the things that your child self didn't receive. And then when people have their own children, that is another time where reparenting really comes into the picture. Um, yeah, and I think that's more of what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm thinking. I mean, again, where I come from, when I think about it, and maybe when we talk to lots of parents, when we think reparenting, it's like I've noticed since becoming a parent that some stuff does come up,
Mm,
but it's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is all the time. But some stuff definitely comes up where you're like, whoa, was I in this situation
mm,
before? Or why, how does this feel familiar? I'm parenting myself all over, or I'm going to say all over again, but that's what I mean. This whole, like, how does that all relate to us as parents in this perinatal period, just in the postpartum period, specifically when we're parenting our young ones?
yeah. Okay. So I think in postpartum specifically, there is this realization for a lot of people of the innocence and the fragility of this new baby. That you have this fresh life in your hands and you're realizing, oh my gosh, I could do whatever I wanted, whether it is taking care of them or whether it is really creating significant harm. And for so many people, that's an incredibly frightening thought. Of course it is, as it should
Hmm.
be. Um, and and for those that have experienced trauma, neglect in childhood, there's that additional layer of, is this what my parents felt about me?
Mm.
And why did they not act in the same way that I'm hoping to act like with this child? And so that can be, am I allowed to swear? Sorry, I should
Please.
have asked that. Okay, I
Yes.
was gonna say that can be a bit of a mind fuck
Yeah.
because
Right.
yeah, you're looking at this little person that you've brought into the world that you want the best for, and the realization that that didn't happen for you in any sort of different kind of way. So I know you said earlier big T trauma versus little t trauma, right? So if
Hmm.
you're listening to this and you're like, yeah, there are some significant events in my life that I can point to and say, this terrible thing happened to me. That is why I feel like this. That could be more of that big T trauma, those very specific, like huge catastrophic events. If you have more of that unsettled feeling, or you just feel like my parents could have done better, that's maybe more of that like little t trauma kind of stuff, right? So that might be more of like more emotional neglect, or subtle abuse, or gaslighting, as you know, people are talking a lot about gaslighting recently. Um, but yeah, so that would be the difference. So there are a lot of people who come to me and we're starting to do this work and they're realizing that they're engaging in reparenting, but they don't necessarily know exactly why, right? They're like, I had a good childhood. Like my parents fed me and clothed me and took care of me. And sometimes it's just looking at some of the finer details of like, okay, that's all true, but how did you feel? And not necessarily wanting your child to feel the same way. Um, yeah, so that's more of that postpartum. In parenting generally, though, I think there's also something really valuable to be said around the amount of research and understanding that has come out around child development in the last, like I'm in my mid 30s, so the last 30-ish years, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people I talk to too are really on board with gentle or like conscious or responsive parenting. And it is maybe our parents who don't have as much of an understanding of that or see it as um, being really permissive. Uh, and so then when we as adult children maybe want to share with them, hey, I'm doing this differently, the way that you did this with me was not helpful or was harmful, there is immense pushback. And there is this idea of, well, we did this and you were fine, even though you're saying, like, hey, I'm not fine, actually.
Oh, yeah.
um, and
Yeah.
so, yeah. So that's a very common experience, even for people who really their parents did like a great job considering like the time and the place, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, I think that is where reparenting comes in as well, because there are instances in which you are not going to receive the care that you might really yearn for or hope for from your parents, even as an adult. And so you have to do some of that work to really parent that little you that's inside, regardless of that.
Right. Right. I there's so much running through my brain right now. Um
That's what I said. Like, I can just go on this one for a
oh
while.
gosh. I mean,
I just want to point out some nuance here, which is that for people who are listening who grew up in abusive or neglectful households, often there will be the message that their parents did the best that they could. And in some cases, that is true. But often it is used as a kind of weaponization to say, they did the best that they could, so you have no right to quote unquote complain, right? Because they just didn't know better.
mm,
And so
mm,
for people like you or I would count myself in the same situation as you, it sounds like, where I really did have parents who wanted the best for me, who did all that they could to ensure that. Um, and yeah, there were some things that, like, now as an adult, I wish could be different, or I wish had been approached in a different way. But I know in the end that they really tried hard. And so that idea of like they did the best that they could for some people really lands. And for others, it doesn't, because the truth is that there are some parents out there who could have tried harder. um, and then now, see, and this is where it gets a little sticky too, is now we live in this time where we have so much access to information, we have so much access to social media that we can feel like I'm not doing enough just all the time. And so that gets into a whole other thing, right? Where like we have to be very careful about the information that we're taking in because of that. But I just wanted to point out that there can be both, right? We can understand that like someone did what they knew to do or what they understood to do, and they still could have done better in some areas. And it doesn't negate that the good that they did, but it also doesn't forgive some of the harm caused.
yeah. That makes total
Yeah.
sense. That makes total sense. When it comes to the reparenting, like who is this for? Basically for anyone who wants to revisit or feels like going back to things or ways that they felt in childhood could be different.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes,
So,
in a nutshell.
sure. Yeah. I would say reparenting really is for everyone. So, you don't necessarily need to have had significant trauma in your background in order to engage in this. Reparenting is is the process of like nurturing your own inner child. And so that's really applicable to anybody because we all have a little inner child. So if you are someone who wants to parent differently than you were parented, if you are trying to really be a cycle breaker, like if you're aware of significant trauma or abuse that you do not want to perpetuate in your own children, I would definitely engage in this. And then I'd say if you are someone who you notice that you are experiencing a significant level of distress or anger when your child is engaging in like less desirable behavior or if they have big emotions, if you're noticing that that's really coming up for you, I would then say that it's worth looking at reparenting or even just approaching some of these things from that perspective. Reparenting doesn't have to be in the way that we're talking about it. It doesn't need to be a really, really intense process. It really can just kind of be like an everyday sort of thing, an awareness that you develop.
Mm. So piggybacking off of what you just said and that awareness, because I experienced this, I know
Hmm.
my friends experienced this. I work with a lot of families, and inevitably we talk about these things, and a lot of people will say and feel really bad and guilty that they did something wrong,
Hmm.
when we all think that we need to parent a certain way and there is this one particular way of doing it. But when our child is having a big tantrum or something is going on, say, and it gets to a level where
Hmm.
now we as the adult get more agitated
Hmm.
or then react a certain way. And that, I guess, is that kind of what you're saying, is like if those kinds of things are causing us to create a bigger reaction, is
Yeah.
that something
Um,
worth? Yeah.
yes. So it's completely normal. It's totally normal for us to be faced with a toddler, let's say, um, who is acting out in a big way, and we simply become overstimulated. Like we've been trying to settle this down for a long time, and we're feeling really frustrated, and we just want it to stop. And maybe we raise our voice or we do something that further escalates our child, and it doesn't help us in the long run. That's all normal and expected. And what's important there is that you're then doing the repair work, right? So you are like going back to your child and you're making sure they understand that it wasn't them that caused that. It was like you
Totally.
working
Yeah.
through your own stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's normal. If you feel that that happens constantly, or if you feel that things that shouldn't bother you are really bothering you, um, and you don't totally know why, then I think it would be definitely worth like looking more at that self-reflection that comes with the reparenting sort of process.
So if we talk about feeling that distress and how often we might
Mhm.
feel it, what does that look like? Because I bet that looks differently for everybody, right? Or depending on the situation.
Yeah, it totally does. So, okay, so there are four different kinds of trauma responses. There are more coming out as we learn more about like what trauma looks like and how people's brains and bodies respond to it, but at the moment we can confidently say that there are four. Most people know the first two. So the first one is the fight response. So when we're talking about like fight or flight, that's what we are. That's where we are here. So
Mm-hmm.
fight would be that you feel that you are unsafe and you are going to fight back in some way, whether that's physically, verbally, whatever. Flight is the second, and that is where you feel you're in danger, and your reaction is to just try and escape the situation. Um, Now, what's interesting about the next two is that the second two responses are often the ones that women or people that present or have been raised as women um, seem to identify with more. So the third is the freeze response. So that's you feel unsafe. And so you basically just shut down. Like, and this can be physically or mentally. So if it's a physical response, it's like your whole body just kind of stops moving. You feel like you're rooted to the spot and you can't fight or flight.
Mm.
And then mentally, that can be like decision paralysis, right? Of like, well, I have become overwhelmed with information. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to completely shut down. And we do see that in kids a lot too, is that
Right.
response. And then the fourth one is called fawn. Have you heard of this?
No. I've heard of
Okay.
freeze, but I haven't heard of fawn.
Yeah, so we see the fawn response often when we're talking about birth trauma. So even from my own experience, like being in the labor room and being really scared and laughing and joking with the staff. I had an entire NICU team come into the room, and I remember from the bed, and they're probably like 25 feet away. It was a massive room.
Mm-hmm.
Um, being like, "Hey guys, how you doing?" And they're like, "We're fine. My name's Stan. I'm with the NICU team." And I'm like, "Okay, great. We're doing really good over here." None of that's true. That's not how I felt on the inside. But on the outside, it felt safer for me to be friends with these people, to make them comfortable in this space in order to increase safety for me.
Wow.
And yeah, and so a lot of people engage in some of that behavior without really even recognizing it.
Yeah. I mean, I can
Yeah.
see how you wouldn't necessarily, well, I know I can't, but it's I've I can relate.
Okay. Okay, so that's how we might respond to other adults. What this can look like if you are engaging in these responses with a child, however, if you're an adult, is obviously like fight's pretty obvious. You're going to argue with them or even like physically have an altercation. Flight is you maybe decide you're just leaving the room. Freeze is you really just don't know what to do and like you become super overwhelmed or overstimulated. And then fawn could be something like you want the behavior to stop, and so you're going to just like give them a piece of candy and like move on, right? You just want it to stop because it feels so unsafe in your body, and so you're like, okay, I'll make you happy. um
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so these are important to recognize. So if you feel you are engaging in these kinds of responses quite often, then I think reparenting is could be valuable, to examine what it was that really, like, what was part of your childhood experience when you were expressing some of these needs or when you were expressing big emotions, right? Were your parents able to tolerate it? Were your parents engaging in some of these behaviors? Were they yelling? Were they leaving you, alone? And then what that taught you about yourself. So with that being said, I did write out some questions that people
Mm-hmm.
can ask themselves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's get into
So
that.
yeah, so this is a time to grab a pen and a paper if you are one of those people who'd like to know. So kind of already gotten into like the very beginning of this, which is really identifying what your triggers are. And so this would be noticing when you get into those responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Um, so, do you notice that it is when the kids get home from school? Do you notice that it's during dinner time? Do you notice that it is when you are asking your child to get their shoes on and they won't get their damn shoes on? And you are thinking in your head, well, they should listen to me. I would never have been allowed to do this as a child, right? Like recognizing when this is happening, and paying attention to, so paying attention to what feelings come up then, paying attention to what's happening right before, what's happening during it, what's happening after. So that's where you're going to want to start. So this isn't something that the first time you're going to start noticing this, you're going to be like, this says something about my worth as a person. Like, no, this might this might require also some therapy. But the first step is really that noticing and even recognizing that it's happening. And then if you can recognize patterns, right, of like when this is happening, then that can be really valuable and helpful information.
Hmm. So recognizing
Hmm.
that it's happening, see if there's patterns, not judging
Yeah,
yourself
yeah,
that it's happening,
yeah.
because it probably does to everybody.
Hmm.
But yes, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So then what? Where do we go with there?
Okay, so then if we are recognizing, like, hey, some of this is coming from like what was expected of me when I was a child, I have some questions that you can kind of direct that conversation with yourself. So I would ask, like, what were the dynamics in your house growing up? What were the expectations that were placed on you? Were those expectations that were placed on you age appropriate? Like, were your parents responsive if you like shared that something wasn't working? Did you feel dismissed? Did you feel ignored? Were your concerns listened to? What happened in your house if you expressed an emotion that was less desirable? Like if you were really, really sad or if you really felt angry, right? Um, Often, I was going to say sometimes, and it's like, no, no, often,
Mm.
particularly if you have small children and or teenagers, their problems seem really big to them. And as adults, we can be like, that's not a problem, right? Like, you just have to tie your
Sure.
shoe,
Yeah.
or your
Yeah.
friend didn't say hi to you at gym. When you brought those things up to your parents, did they respond in the way that matched how important that issue was to you? Or did they respond according to how important that issue was to them? Right? So things like that, just really thinking about, okay, how was I treated? There are going to be some people for which some of those answers are really obvious. And that's again when we're talking about like significant neglect or abuse. And there are going to be some people where it's really not, or it wasn't all the time. It was just in regards to like one concern, right? Working with a lot of women, a lot of the time we have conversations around body image, particularly in postpartum and parenting. And when we talk about that, we see a lot of that messaging coming from our mothers, our grandmothers. I was even talking to someone the other day about how, like, my mom, um, we had to like get dressed to go to the grocery store, and now you just like go to the grocery store and whatever you're wearing. But
Right.
this, yeah, like the expectations of like you are going to present in this certain way because that's what we do. That's how we feel about our body. That's how we prove our worth, right? As women, to be like desirable in this way. And then how does that then translate to your own thoughts around your body and how you're supposed to present and how you are, how your children are supposed to present? A lot of the time too, like a good question is, did your parents see you as your own person or as an extension of themselves? So were you like
Mm.
representing them out in the world, or were you your own person and you were allowed to make like mistakes and do stupid things and um yeah, and still have that love, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
um
Yeah.
yeah.
Those sound like all very insightful questions that you could really deep dive into. So
Yeah,
I'm
they
going to be
are.
doing that.
I was gonna say they are not like a 15-minute thought experiment. It's like over time for sure. Um, so now we're gonna get into some of the hows of it, I guess.
Please. I'm excited.
Yeah. Okay. So along with all the other noticing I've asked people to do, one of the things to notice is how connected or not you feel to your body. So, for some people, you might go through the world feeling like you're kind of a talking head and like your body serves the purpose of just moving you from one place to another. And if you know that about yourself, then it's going to be really important to start to pay attention to your body and to be using more of these like body focused techniques. I'm going to share some of them in this conversation. But the reason for that is because your body is holding on to all of these memories. It's holding on to all of these experiences that when it recognizes is happening again, can send you into that response, right?
Mm.
So if you're sitting at dinner and you're like, "Oh no, that's what I heard as a child," and you feel like your shoulders are coming up and you have a tightness in your chest or like your stomach's feeling a little like wibbly wobbly and you are trying to decide like what to do. Do I advocate? Do I not? That's all stuff you're going to miss if you're not actually paying attention to your body, right? And so when your body starts to kind of tell you that something's wrong, there is some kind of a threat or a danger, then it's as important to pay attention to that and to um, kind of provide it some reassurance via like body focused strategies. So, um, here are a few. And if you're a client of mine listening, I'm so sorry you've heard all of these before. But some of them can feel a little bit silly. And we're just going to roll with it. So, one, my personal favorite is doing something called brushing. So, I know this is an audio medium, but you're going to start at the top of your head and like brush down your body just with your hands, like down your arms, down your torso, down your legs. This is, something that you can step out of a room, pop into a closet, do it real quick. It does a whole bunch of different things. Number one, it just feels good. It reminds you that your body exists, right? It forces you to pay attention to it. And you can also add another element of like imagining that whatever feelings coming up for you, whether it's anxiety, whether it's fear, whatever it is, that um, you can imagine it being a part of your body, and then with the action of brushing it off, actually brushing it through.
I was going to
Depending on
say,
what
it
you
feels like the act of just doing that action is
Mhm.
like you're just getting it off of your skin and getting it off you.
Yes. Yeah. So, like, if you're someone who enjoys visualizations, determining what the color is, determining what the texture is it tacky? Is it something that's like oily, right? Can you flick it off of your fingers? Um, Engaging in behaviors like that. So, another one, if you're someone who grew up around horses, this can be really helpful to understand, like, as an example is that if you've ever watched horses, prey animals, like other kind of prey animals would do this too. And they sense that something's going on. They will like lift their heads and their ears perk up and all their muscles kind of go like "Whoop," come up and they're ready to sprint because that's going to be their best defense mechanism is to flee. And then when they realize like, oh, it was just like a hat, their muscles come down, but they're not all the way relaxed yet, and so they do that shaking.
Right, right.
And we can do that as humans. We can utilize that. It's signaling to our body like, oh, actually, like there isn't a threat. We're okay right now. Like we are actually in a safe space. You can also do things like have a small object that you pay close attention to. I love rocks, so I've got rocks all over the place. Having something that you can pay attention to the texture, the weight, does it have heft? What's the temperature? Things that bring you back into your body. The part we're missing, though, I'm realizing in this conversation, is this idea of the inner child, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
where do they come into this? So, you can spend time reflecting on like who is my inner child? How old are they? Right? Is it me when I'm 6? Is it me when I first thought about how like I don't know. I I was like taller than all the kids in my 4th grade class, and I was like first aware of how I didn't feel like my body fit in. Maybe I was 9, right? Like whichever version of you it is. Um, and then we are going to do things to intentionally engage with that inner child. So these could be more simple things, basic things like nurturing, right? So, making sure that they're sufficiently fed, that you are giving them like nutrient dense items, and you're also enjoying food um, in a way that they would have wanted to enjoy it, right? That's especially important if you are dealing with like more of those like body image kinds of concerns. Um, Taking the time to pay attention to what your inner child is trying to tell you. So, if you are feeling particularly stressed or triggered by something, imagining how that child would have felt and then providing them with the support that they would have needed. So, for example, if it is like, if we go back to the child putting on their shoes, right? Your kid's trying to put on their shoes, they're taking forever. You're starting to get upset, or you're noticing that, like, okay, it feels like anger, but what I think it is actually fear, right? Because when I was a kid, if I didn't get my shoes on fast enough, my parent would yell at me or would hit me or would threaten to leave the house without me. And that scared me.
Mm.
And then being able to recognize, like, hey, little child me, it's okay. Like, we're going to get your shoes on. It's going to be okay. I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to hurt you. Like, you are actually safe in this moment. If we bring this into the physical world, then you can do things such as providing a comfort item for your inner child. So maybe you had a favorite teddy bear when you were a kid, and you go out and you find an item that fits that same description or that feels right to you, that you can bring with you places, right? If they're small enough, you could bring them wherever you wanted. That little piece of comfort for your inner child can go with you wherever you would like. um, really just taking care and paying attention. If you're someone who likes to write, like writing letters back and forth can be a really therapeutic process. I would say if you are someone who, um, like, if there are significant things that you're working through, I would say it's valuable to go ahead and seek out like therapeutic support through that process. Um, if it's not financially accessible to you, there are really good resources online. There's lots of Instagram accounts kind of in this area, um, that can help with that process too. But if it is really, really heavy stuff, I would say that there is a risk to getting really far into it and then maybe not knowing how to come back out.
Right. You'd want some
And so
extra
that's just something to
support
keep in mind.
for going there. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's maybe in this world of parenting our
Hmm.
children, and being the person that we were hoping that someone was there for us. Even though we still
Yes.
may love our parents very much, there would be instances where we maybe would have liked things to have go a little differently. And so we're trying to now reparent and change that with our kids.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And making that connection too between your own child, if you do have a child, and your child's self, right? And so maintaining a certain level of patience for both of them to
Mm.
realize that like you've been there, right? Um, and a part of that too is like separating your child's behavior from your worth as a person, because it can feel really upsetting, um, as an adult to see your child engaging in behaviors that maybe wouldn't have been tolerated when you were a child, and attaching like your own feelings about that to them. And and so I would advise like trying to make that separation.
Mm.
um
It's
yeah.
there's still there's so much to unpack that you could unpack with this, like, and I see how where those questions that you were sharing with us, how that there is some unpacking to do there. Like, it would
Hmm.
take some time. You'd want to take some proper time if you're going through that process to really think about
Yes.
that. Probably would be great to have some support along the journey,
It's a
because in case other and emotions come up, things come up.
Oh, yes.
um
And it's a highly individualized process as well.
sure.
So that's
Yeah.
why it's like, okay, for some people, they're going to want to do writing. For some people, they are going to want to go out and purchase a teddy bear. For some people, they are going to want to have a photo of themselves, as a child
Mm.
and use that as something that they really connect with, right? It's very, very individual.
Yeah. But there's options. It's kind of
Mhm.
figuring out what works and what they need
Absolutely.
based on.
The sky's the
Yeah.
limit.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much
Hmm.
for giving us a good to me it feels like an introduction to this, because I find
Yeah.
when we talk more about these things, about just what is new research coming out around child development, what is like all this parenting stuff, like you said, there can be so much information out there. At one time there wasn't enough, now there's too
Hmm.
much, and so it's all trying to find that balance. And so I really appreciate people like yourself, especially like because your Instagram account is amazing, like Two Birds Counseling. We're going
Oh,
to link to that
thanks.
in the show notes, but I really feel that way because you really you're not shy to just show yourself and show that like you kind of practice what you preach, I guess. And like, this is how I do this
Mm.
for me. It might not be how somebody else does it, but like the way you shake things out. or dance things out. Or maybe that was your version of the horse doing his thing, which I never knew that. But like I've done that, like either a big cleansing breath or like a like a shake.
Yeah.
And I see that like, oh yeah, that is like a horse. And like, oh, I didn't realize that's why horses did that.
Yes.
Very interesting.
I realized I forgot to point something out,
Oh,
which is
yes.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It just ties into this.
Great.
Which is that the reason that I provide so many body focused strategies is because often when we talk about like trying to regulate ourselves, what we think we're supposed to do is like take deep breaths or meditate or practice like mindfulness,
stillness and quiet.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that can be stillness and quiet can feel so dangerous when you are already feeling like you're unsafe, right? And so a lot of people I talk to, I would say probably 75 to 80% of people I talk to, when we have a conversation about like, okay, well, what are you already doing? They're like, well, I try deep breaths and I try this and I just, it doesn't work. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Let's try these other 5 things. And let's just see what lands and go from there, right? So just to take away a little bit of the pressure of it's not that you failed if taking a deep breath doesn't help calm you down when like your kid won't put their shoes on, right? There are some other things that you can do. Yeah.
Yes, that will. And you're putting those out there, so I appreciate.
But yeah, I do try to show what it looks like practically, what things look like in the day to day, to say like, hey, I'm struggling with grief, for instance. And here are the things that I've decided to do about it. Is it going to solve it? No, my dad is still dead. But I can like help myself through some of these feelings right now. And so, yeah, I just really appreciate that that's something that speaks to you, I guess.
Absolutely. That I look for accounts like that, to be quite honest. That's that authenticity that you look for. Well, that I do. I so appreciate anyone, in particular yourself, because you're definitely, of the people that I follow, you're up there in terms of like putting it out there and being honest. So I appreciate it. I have a feeling others do too. But I very much appreciate this chat about reparenting, because I think it is a conversation we can continue having. We're going to stew on those questions a little bit. Yeah. We know where we can find you for support. And I know you're at Two Birds Counselling on Instagram, but and is your website, is it twobirdscounseling.ca? Okay, beautiful.
Yeah. That's me. Instagram is where I send everyone. What I tell clients, like when we do a consult call, is like how I show up on Instagram, how I am on this podcast, how I am on this phone call, is what you're getting. So I'm not for everyone, but I am for some people. But yeah, you can find all my stuff through Instagram at Two Birds Counseling.
Beautiful. Thanks so much for giving us those things to think about, and well, just all of this to think about. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
If you're looking for more information or support along your parenting journey, check out birthbabysleep.ca. That's where you're going to find prenatal classes, postpartum and new baby resources, and sleep support during the childhood years. You can now join our Bringing Up Baby community membership as well, which has tons of additional benefits to helping you through all kinds of sleep challenges and transitions, navigating the transition to solid foods, and even your transition through early parenthood. If you have any questions, just send them my way. Lastly, but certainly not least, if you got something out of this episode or our show in general, leaving a rating or a quick review goes a really long way to helping others find us. So please consider leaving one. That's all for now. I'm Ashley Cooley, and we'll see you back here next time.